All right, today we're going to be looking at Jackson and his policy of Indian removal. This is probably one of the biggest things that Jackson is known for in American history. So at the time period, this is about the 1830s, there are two predominant ideas about Native Americans in the United States. The first is that they should assimilate to American culture. So assimilation basically just means when a minority group gives up what makes them unique, parts of their culture that are special to them, in favor of adopting parts of a larger culture. So here's a really good visual representation of assimilation. Basically this idea that Native Americans should adopt American culture. They should learn English and they should practice Christianity and they should participate in traditional farming techniques and agricultural techniques and things like that, which also meant that they would have to leave behind all the things that made them uniquely Native. So that was one idea about Native Americans at the time. Another idea is that if natives refused to assimilate, then they should be removed. And there were a number of treaties that were being signed, most of them forcibly signed, that gave Native Americans a little bit of money, if any, and then forced off into lands in the West where they would be on these reservations or these Indian territories, so that the land they were living on would then go to white farmers. So we see these attitudes and ideas towards natives all kind of wrapped up in a piece of legislation called the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So what this law did is it forced the relocation of 5 tribes. They were nicknamed the 5 civilized tribes. You can see them there at the bottom: Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole. They're all in the southeast. It forced all of them to move into an area that's today known as Oklahoma, but back then it was just called Indian Territory. In theory, in writing, what this law said is that this relocation would be voluntary and that Native Americans would receive payment for their land, and if they stayed, then they should assimilate. However, in reality, this law actually looked like forced treaties. So Native Americans were forced, sometimes, with the military intimidating them, forced to sign these treaties, and then they were moved westward and treated very harshly along the routes to the west, as well as once they got to this new Indian territory. So there were several different routes, just kind of depending on where these natives came from. The most famous one that we'll talk a little bit about later is this blue one right here. It's the route of the Cherokee, and it was called the Trail of Tears. And that's because the Cherokee were specifically targeted by the American government because they are the ones who are going to resist the Indian Removal Act the most. We see this resistance in the form of an important Supreme Court case. So this court case is known as Worcester v. Georgia. This is actually during the Marshall Court. I know we haven't talked about that in a while, but remember John Marshall, Supreme Court Chief Justice. He's all about expanding the power of the federal government here. So let's look at the players in this court case. Worcester was a guy named Samuel Worcester. He was a U.S. citizen. He was known as being a supporter or an ally to the Cherokee, and he agreed that they shouldn't have to move off their land. The reason why Georgia is involved in this Supreme Court case is because Georgia passed a series of state laws that forced Native Americans off their land because gold was found in some of these areas, as well as there were white farmers who wanted to move into some of these Native American areas in Georgia. So Georgia passed these state laws that were very similar to the federal law of the Indian Removal Act. So Worcester sues on behalf of the Cherokee. He sues the state of Georgia. Now this is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court, where John Marshall decides a few things. One is that he decides Cherokee are a distinct nation. They are not Americans. They are actually a foreign country in the eyes of America. And therefore, they don't have to listen to state laws, right? In the same way that like French people don't listen to North Carolina laws because they live in France. Marshall's kind of saying the same thing here. The Cherokee are an independent country, thus they don't have to listen to Georgia. Then John Marshall said, and also because the Cherokee are technically a different country, only the federal government can conduct foreign policy with them. So Georgia, you should keep your nose out of it. Only really the federal government can be the one negotiating treaties with the Cherokee. So he decides that the Cherokee do not need to relocate. So it's time to enforce this ruling to force Georgia to drop their laws that are unconstitutional, according to John Marshall. And Jackson refuses to. He says, I'm not going to enforce this ruling. Georgia can do whatever they want. He actually has this famous quote where he says, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. So this is a really important precedent that Jackson is setting here, where he is deliberately ignoring the Supreme Court. I mean, this is unconstitutional here. So when Jackson is often called unconstitutional, this is kind of what we're talking about. He is deliberately ignoring the constitutional way that the three branches of the government are set up. So this process to remove Native Americans to this Indian territory now, which is Oklahoma, was largely directed by the military. The military would show up at the houses of these natives. At the end of a barrel of the gun, the natives would be forced off their land. They weren't able to really gather any supplies or prepare at all to start this march west. Now, like I told you, the most severe and the harshest of these routes is this blue one. It's called the Trail of Tears. This is the Cherokee route to relocation in the Indian Territory. It was conducted in the winter of 1838. It's 800 miles and 4,000 people died in this route that went out west. I don't want to say it's a rumor, it's a legend, but the idea is that it was conducted in the winter on purpose, knowing that the conditions you can see here would be incredibly harsh on the natives. Many of them starved to death, froze to death. Lack of supplies, food, clothing, that kind of thing was definitely very harmful to them. And it took about 2 months to make this journey to Oklahoma. And once they got to Oklahoma, not just the Cherokee, but all of these other tribes, once they got there, they're confronted with unfamiliar climate, unfamiliar land. They also face hostility from white farmers who are also moving out west who want that land. And they're all really close together. They don't speak the same languages or have the same customs. They're all vying for the same scarce resources. And so it's a really tough place to live. And eventually, as America continues to expand out west, that land, which was in the 1830s supposed to be reserved for Native Americans, that land is going to be sold to white settlers and also to railroad companies who want to build railroads through Oklahoma. Eventually, Oklahoma is abandoned as a reservation for Native Americans and becomes a full U.S. state. And so we'll see later on in this course what happens to the natives that are living here and where they get forced to relocate next. So we spent a few objectives talking about the events and the actions of Jackson during his administration. And it's kind of time to look now at some of the legacy that Jackson left behind. And we're going to separate it into pros and cons here. So some positive things about Jackson's legacy. I think that he's one of these presidents who tried to represent the will of the common man. He and everything he did was, in his mind, looking out for the common people, the farmers, including moving Native Americans off their land. He would say it's because the common man should be living there, or killing the bank and destroying the economy. Well, it's because the common people weren't benefiting from the bank. So all of these things that he did, he can kind of back it up with, well, I did it for the common people. He also expanded the power of the president. He used the veto more than any other president, which is totally constitutional. The president is allowed to do that. And so we see him really using that executive power. He was a war hero. Remember the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans. He was a self-made man. He came from nothing over at a young age, never went to school, to being a prominent lawyer, and then eventually president of the United States. And he also was the only president to pay off in full the federal debt in 1835. Some negative things about Jackson, though, are that he used the spoil system, right? He hired his party supporters, which in the end kind of creates an inefficient, corrupt government. And that spoil system is going to continue on for the next about 50 years. He was also uncompromising with South Carolina during the nullification crisis, basically leading us to the brink of a civil war because he couldn't compromise in this nullification crisis. He caused the Panic of 1837 when he removed all the money from the national bank to the pet banks and then issued the specie circular. So he caused, I don't want to say the country's first depression, but the first the biggest oppression that our country had up until that point. He initiated Indian removal. Even though the Trail of Tears and some of the other routes actually happened during Van Buren's administration, the next president after him, he's the one who got the ball rolling on that. It was really just Van Buren who was carrying out what Jackson already started. He also ignored the Supreme Court and with the decision in Worcester v. Georgia, which is unconstitutional to say the least there. So, I think that because of the whole ethnic cleansing Native American thing, that's definitely one of the biggest stains on his legacy. Jackson definitely has a contested legacy, positive, negative. How do you really judge this guy and what he did? There's a really good video right here. If you want to look at it, the PowerPoint. It's called History versus Andrew Jackson. It's one of those TED Ed Talk videos. And it's really good looking at the pros and the cons and kind of getting you set up for you to kind of think about, how should his legacy be deemed? Positive, negative, mixture of both. It's up to you.